Thanks for joining us online. Hope Chapel exists to lead people to experience real life in Jesus for the hope of the world. We pray that as you watch today, you will find both hope for yourself and be compelled to bring hope to the world around you. Now, for more information about the church and ways to get connected, go to visithopechapel.com.
Well, good morning, Hope Chapel. It is so good to be able to be here in this place. We enjoyed worshiping with you last weekend for the first time in 4 years, and it's so good to be back in person here with you, this church family. And so good. Welcome to those who are joining us online. Man, what an honor it is to be able to spend this time with you today. Hey, before I dive in this morning, Pastor Jake mentioned a few things about us already, but just want to kind of continue that introduction. So my wife, Sarah, and I, we've been married for 18 years. We do have 4 kids. The oldest, Jonathan, is 14, then Caleb, Hannah, Rebecca just turned 7, and my kids are amazing. My family is amazing. If you spend any time around us, you'll quickly learn that I am the weakest link, no holds barred in my family. They are all way better than I am. One of the greatest heists in human history is when Sarah said, "I do." She didn't understand what she was getting into, but I liked it and I put a ring on it. So some of you don't, okay. Anyway, so the past 4 years we've been in Meridian, Mississippi, and so we're glad to be back, and it's such an honor to be here. Hey guys, you know this already, but I just want to say it. God is doing something special in Hope Chapel. In all of our locations, he's doing something unique. And here's what you need to know. COVID and all of the things that it feels like it's upended and kind of rewritten and all those things, it has not stopped, sidelined, or sidetracked anything that God wants to do inside of this church family, inside of this community, in our cities and across our nation. It has not sidelined any of those things. And here's what I hope we'll understand, you know, as we go through these weeks and these years together, is God writes the best stories. There's no way that we would have ever imagined when we stood, actually I stood in this spot a little over 4 years ago, and they're heading into a new adventure that God would continue to write our story, and I'd be standing back in this spot 4 years later. He writes the best stories. And just because we don't understand what the story is going to be in the moment that we're in doesn't mean that God isn't writing something powerful and something, you know, just overwhelmingly good for you, for your family, and for our world, even in the midst of difficulty. So last week we started this series, this new teaching series called Uncanceled. And there's a greater dialogue in our nation right now, and there's a phrase that's gaining popularity, and it's this phrase, cancel culture. And here's the thing. In the coming months, in the next couple of months, those 2 words are going to gain a whole variety of meanings, and we're not trying in any way, shape, or form to try to address all the variety of those meanings in these next weeks together. That's not what we're trying to do. There's no way that we could do that. We're not trying to talk about what's red or blue or what's left or right or any of those things. We're not making an attempt to do that. But for our purposes, what we're defining cancel culture is as this. Cancel culture is the practice of publicly identifying, categorizing, or labeling people based upon their worst moments, because we all have a worst moment. But it's not just that we're going to try to label them based upon their worst moments. We're labeling them based upon their worst moments for a purpose. And that purpose is to shame, demean, devalue, and ultimately to dismiss someone as irrelevant. In other words, when I cancel you, I no longer need to pay attention to you. I can just discard you as irrelevant. You're a part of the past. And the determination that we're making together during this series, as we kind of look at these things, is we say, hey, we're not going to look at all of the things in our world and process our faith based upon all the circumstances of our world. What we want to do is we want to look at all the circumstances of our world and process them on the basis of our faith. What is it that God would say about these things together? And like you, in my life, there have been different times where I've been canceled. I've been canceled and suddenly cut off from relationships. I've been discarded based upon mistakes that I've made. I have, been sequestered as irrelevant based upon my beliefs. And as hard as that is, and I am a recovering people pleaser, All right, so it's incredibly hard for me. Maybe some of you are like that too. I'm a recovering people pleaser, and it's incredibly hard that people might, judge or cancel or whatever you want to call that to me. I don't think that's the hardest part about it. I think the hardest thing is when you begin to cancel yourself. I think that's the hardest part. You ever been in that place? You ever been to a place where you've canceled yourself, where you were convinced that if people really knew what was going on underneath the surface, if people really knew the truth about you, if they knew that thing that you kind of hidden behind the curtain, if they knew that thing that you hadn't talked to anyone about, that you were afraid to share, if they knew it, that they wouldn't accept you, that they wouldn't like you, that they wouldn't love you, that they would leave you. You ever felt like a failure? Like you blew it? I mean, sometimes maybe at one point in time we thought, you know what, my life could make a difference, and I had a purpose, and I had a mission, and I had a dream, and there were all these things that happened, but now I did this thing, and now I'm over here, and I'm just going to try to make the best of it. I'm just going to try to coast through on what I have because I screwed that piece up, and so now all I've just kind of got to do the best with what's left. It's the way that my drug-addicted friend sat across from me and said, Ben, I'm an addict. I've always been an addict. I'll always be an addict. I'll be nothing more than an addict. That's all I'll ever be. That's all people will ever see me as. So I'm not sure why I would ever try to be something else. It's my friend who was sitting on my living room couch, who had all these dreams and all these plans and all these things that they were certain God had called them to. But now they're tears streaming from their eyes, just kind of holding the rubble of a hollow and crumbled marriage, wondering whether any of it is worth it anymore. It's the parent who has once again responded in a hurtful and damaging way in their home, and now they're sitting in the bedroom eating a pint of ice cream, trying to figure out, how do I sort out this failure that I've become? Friends, as much as we fear the rejection and the cancellation of other people, we're downright ruthless to ourselves. We cancel ourselves, and here's the thing, crumbling on the inside, it's all rotting away, and it feels like it's a house of cards that could just blow with the wind, and nobody has a clue. Nobody knows how deeply we're hurt. Nobody knows how hollow we are on the inside because we're keeping it all together, and we're doing all the things, and we've got our kids where they need to go, and we're performing at work, and we're meeting our numbers, and we're doing all that stuff, but all along on the inside, we're rotting and we're crumbling, and it's just a matter of time before it all falls apart, and we feel like we're a failure. Nobody knows. And if you find yourself there today, if you find yourself there in the future, I think there's a guy in the Bible who knows a little bit about that. And I want to look at his story together today. It's a guy named Moses. And so if you have a Bible, I want you to go ahead and turn it on or flip it open, whatever works for you, to Exodus chapter 2. And I want us to understand a little bit about Moses as we jump into his story. Moses was born into a culture of genocide. From the moment Moses was born, from birth, people immediately surrounding Moses believed that he should be put to death or at a minimum harshly mistreated due to his race, due to what he looked like and what he believed. The nation of Israel, Moses' people, were captive slaves to Pharaoh and the Egyptian people. That sort of context, when you're literally born into that, no matter kind of how things play out from that point forward, that begins to shape you. And in this incredible turn of events, Moses, rather than being killed upon birth, which was what was supposed to happen, Moses ends up being raised by Pharaoh's daughter in the palace. He grew up. This Hebrew kid who was supposed to die within the first year of his life, the first moments of his life, this Hebrew kid grows up in the luxury and the comfort of the Egyptian palace. He went to the best schools. He wore the best clothes. He drove the best camels. He ate the best food, all of those things. Actually, Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that because Pharaoh had no son, he had no heir, it's likely that Moses was actually being groomed for a future on the throne, as the future as the ruler of the world's superpower at the time. But the challenge with Moses is he was different. He wasn't like all the other Egyptians. It's because he wasn't Egyptian at all. He was Hebrew, and he knew it, and everybody around him knew it. And even though he had a sense of comfort and kind of insulation around him, I believe that Moses growing up in the palace was still subjected to, and he was very familiar with kind of side-eye glances or hushed insults or any of those things. And for the first 40 years of Moses' life, what we see is his star just continues to rise. He just continues to grow closer and closer and closer and closer to the throne of Egypt. Yet all the while, that entire time, his people, the Hebrew people, were being brutally oppressed. And because all around him, Moses, he sees kind of what's happening in his life, but then he sees anybody who looks like him, who kind of has his background and has some of the same ancestors and some of the same family that he has. He sees those people being just completely discarded. They live nothing like him. And during those years, a dream began to grow inside of Moses, and I'm convinced now that Moses began to see a purpose for his life during those 40 years of upbringing. That Moses began to believe that he would be a big deal, that he had a purpose, that he would be important, that he would bring deliverance and he would bring freedom to his people, that Moses, would be the hero. And when you begin to slow down and begin to, consider the first 40 years of Moses' life, you begin to see there's some seeds and some evidence of some unhealthy pride that begins to, grow inside of Moses, that he believed that he was more than he was. And this dream, this inflated view of himself kind of continues to grow until one day it bubbles over. And that's where we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. It says this. It says, one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, and looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. See, Moses had enough. That was enough. He couldn't take it anymore. Now was the time that he needed to act. It was time to become the hero that he knew he was destined to be. He sees this opportunity open up in front of him. He says, now's the time. And so it says in the text that he looks this way and he looks that way to see if anybody's looking, if anybody's around watching him. And I think that's such an insightful part of the story. It's just such an insightful part of the text, because here's the question. Who looks this way and that way before they do something? Who looks this way and that? It's only somebody who knows that they're about to go too far. Somebody who knows that they're about to do something that they have no business doing. See, you and I, we look this way and that when we're about to click on that website. We look this way and that when we're about to send that text message or email. We look this way and that when we're about to place that bet. We look this way and that when we're about to kind of fudge on the report or be a little bit dishonest in the numbers. Friends, you need to understand the moment that you feel the temptation to look this way or that way before you do something, it is like a flashing red light that what you're about to do has the potential to bring you to a place that you have no business being. And so looking this way and looking that way and seeing nobody, Moses kills the Egyptian. It's excessive force at its finest. We don't know, maybe in his rage, he thought his position in the palace had entitled him to bring this sort of judgment and retribution upon this Egyptian. But as soon as he was standing over a dead body with blood dripping from his hands, Moses quickly realized that he was in way over his head. Way over his head. He knew he'd gone too far. See, Moses, he had been trained for a destiny, and now he finds himself on the threshold of a disaster. If anyone found out about what he'd done, like everything, all the perks, all the plans, all the things, carefully constructed as they were, would come crashing down on him like a house of cards. And so Moses did what you and I tend to do when we get into a place when we've done something we shouldn't have done. He tries to cover it up. And he tries to cover it up with a few inches of sand. But here's the thing about a few inches of sand. A few inches of sand will never, ever hide the death that lies underneath the surface. A few inches of sand will never quell the stench of death. The truth always finds its way to the surface. But Moses had decided that he was just going to continue to go on. He was going to continue to live like nothing had ever happened at all. And after what I imagine was probably a rough night of sleep, he goes about his business. And in verse 13, it says this. It says, the next day Moses went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting. And he asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? And the man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me like you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I have done must have become known. He instantly knows he's in trouble. Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tries to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and he went to live in Midian where he sat down by a well. Everything. Literally everything. Like there's no area of Moses' life that's not instantly touched and comes crashing down in around him. And here he finds himself in the wilderness, in Midian, in the desert, all alone, not a penny to his name, purposeless, guilty of murder, shrouded in shame. And the story goes on. Moses eventually settles in Midian and he gets married and he joins his father-in-law's business and he swaps the opulence of royalty for the confines of obscurity. And I imagine in the wilderness of Midian, he never talked about his childhood in the palace. He never talked about all the things that he had seen and all the dreams that he had dared to dream. He certainly didn't talk about the mistakes that he had made. He just tried to stuff it down. He just tried to internalize it, just tried to go on with life, all the shame, all the pain. He just tried to make the best of it, make the most of it. He had a purpose, he had a plan, he had a calling, but now that was gone, and so now he was just going to try to kind of live out the rest of his days. And there in that shame-filled wilderness, Moses lives for 40 years. Not 40 hours, 40 months, 40 years. Friend, what have you tried to kick a few inches of sand over in your life? In these days of stress and confusion and isolation, what have you done that you've been trying to kick a few inches of sand over? What is it that you're convinced that if anybody knew, if anybody had a clue, that it would all come crashing in? That they would reject you, that they would cancel you? What self-destructive pattern of behavior, what self-loathing, pattern of thought has you feeling like Moses in Midian, defeated, a failure, worthless, useless to God and useless to others? What has convinced you that God could never use somebody like you to do his extraordinary work in the world? Because you need to know this. In life, the enemy is going to try to take something that you did, and the enemy is going to try to convince you that what you did is actually who you are. In our lives, there's a huge difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is remorse for something that you did, but shame is believing that what you did defines who you are. I wonder sometimes if the reason that Moses spent 40 years in the desert is not because he failed in a moment, but because shame had convinced him that he was now a failure. That's what shame does to us. One of the greatest tools of the enemy that the enemy uses to seek and steal and destroy the life that God has for you is shame. Psychologist Henry Cloud and researchers like Martin Seligman have labeled this pattern of shame-filled thinking, negative thinking, as the 3 Ps of shame. The 3 Ps of shame are this: they're personal, they're permanent, and they're pervasive. The enemy, he makes shame personal. You see, shame and condemnation will always prompt you to speak in the first person about your failures, about your flaws. Instead of just admitting your sin, instead of admitting that you were guilty in an action, we begin to define ourselves by it. And so when the enemy comes, he plants this question inside of you, and the question is this: what's wrong with me? Why am I so broken? Why am I so jacked up? Why am I so deficient? Nobody else is like this. Like everybody else has their stuff together, but I'm the guy, I'm the woman who is just messed up. I have this unique personal problem. Nobody else could identify with it. It's personal, this shame is. But he doesn't stop at making us believe that it's personal. This lie, he extends a little bit further and says it's permanent. Not only do we ask, what's wrong with me, we begin to follow that up with another phrase where we say, I always, or I'll never. In other words, shame and condemnation begins to create a sense of hopelessness inside of us by convincing you that change is not possible, that it'll never be any different. I'm so messed up. I'll always be this way. I'll never get better. There's no hope. I wonder if I should just give up, if I should just give in. Why even try? What's wrong with me? I always. And then there's the third P, the pervasive P, kicks in and says, what's wrong with me? I always mess up everything. Shame is pervasive. It spreads and infects everything in our life. And left unchecked, left untreated, shame and condemnation puts its hooks into every area. And it doesn't take long for us to go from feeling like a failure in one area to feeling like a failure in every area. I mean, you ever notice that? You make a mistake as a parent and you're beating yourself up over that. And then later that night you're going, and not only did I make a mistake as a parent, I am a terrible employee. Like, why do we connect those two things together? How does that happen? It's because the enemy convinces us that shame is not just personal, it's not just permanent, it's pervasive. It goes into every area of our life. And so I want to ask you again, what is it that you're convinced is true about you that has become a refrain that cancels you from ever taking a courageous step for God, for ever stepping out and doing what it is that he wants you to do? When you get quiet, what nags at you? What does you go, man, what's wrong with me? I'm so deficient. I'm so broken. Why can't I ever get that right? Man, I never get anything right. Why am I never good enough? Shame sends the message that it's not just about doing something wrong, it's that we're defective. And it tears everything apart. In his book, Shame, The Power of Caring, author Gershon Kaufman writes this. He says, shame is felt as an inner torment, a sickness of the soul. Shame is a wound felt from the inside, dividing us both from ourselves and from one another. Fortunately, friends, though the enemy has a word, he does not have the last word. This is not the end of Moses' story. After 40 years in the desert, look at what happens to him. It's in Exodus chapter 3, starting verse 1. He says, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire within a bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. And so Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight. Why did the bush not burn up? He didn't know what was going on at this point. And when the Lord saw that Moses had gone over to look, God called out to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. I imagine Moses is stunned. He says, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. In other words, I am not the God of the Egyptians or any other people. I'm your God. You know me. Your people are my people. This is a connection we have. I am he. And at this, Moses, recognizing the situation that he's in, hides his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt, Moses. I saw what you saw. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering, Moses, just like you are. And so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And Moses is standing back and he's slow clapping through the whole thing and giving God applause. He's like, man, this is the thing I've been waiting for. I'm so glad that you're finally going to do it. I'm so glad that you're finally going to come through. I thought that I was going to have a part of that, but clearly I was wrong, because here I am in the desert, and here's what God says. He says, so now go, Moses. And Moses is like, I'm sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And I imagine an awkward pause, and Moses says to God, who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt. And God's reply was this: I will be with you. Moses had thoroughly canceled himself, but his picture of reality did not line up with God's picture of reality at all. And so God blows Moses' mind to appearing to him in an unprecedented way. And see, here's the thing about this story as we continue to read forward in it. Moses has no doubt. He has no doubt that he's having an encounter with the God of Israel. He has no doubt, no doubt about that. He has no doubt that God can actually deliver Israel. He thinks, man, that's a good deal. He has no doubt about that. But Moses does have a doubt, and it's wrapped in his immediate reply to God. What is Moses' immediate response to the overture of God? God, that sounds good. I like your plan, and clearly you've thought it all through, except for one part. Who am I? I mean, God, certainly you have, but have you forgotten who I am? And I love the reply of God to Moses. He says, Moses, I remember. I will be with you. In other words, in the Ben Revised version, he says, Moses, it's really not about you. It's about me. It's not about who you are, Moses. It's about who I am, Moses. Moses, your calling, your purpose was never about your accomplishments. It was never about your accolades. And it certainly is not about your failure. That's not what this is about. You think you have the ability to control all of those things, that it depends on your strength? Moses, come on now. Your calling, Moses, is about your willingness to let me do something in your life and through your life. That's what your calling is connected to. And friends, this is a core gospel issue. You're not defined by what you've done, good or bad. You're defined by who God says you are. To the early church in Rome, Paul writes in Romans chapter 5, he says, you see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. When? According to the scriptures, not according to Ben, when did Christ choose and select to die for you? When you were out there hustling and getting all your stuff in a row and having all the things, and you've got like the perfect parent and the perfect employee and the perfect son and the perfect daughter and the perfect husband and all that stuff, that's when he figured it out? It's like, oh, they're finally good enough? No, the text says, while you were still powerless, while you were sinners, Christ died on the cross for you. That thing that you're trying to cover up with a few inches of sand, and every time the wind blows and begins to reveal a little bit corner of it, you push some more sand over the top of it. In the middle of that may have been surprising to you. It may be appalling to you, but when Jesus Christ chose to go to the cross, he knew that those things were going to happen in your life, and he said, yeah, I'll die for that too. In that moment, and the thing that you'll never talk about, that you'll never share, that you'll never be honest about with anybody, you've never shared it. The thing that you think, like, if your spouse found out, your marriage would fall apart. The thing that if you think if your boss found out, you would never be employable. That thing that if your family found out, you think they would cut you off and reject you forever. Or just that thing that if your kids found out, they would be so disappointed in you that you don't know how they would look you in the eye. That thing, in the moment of that thing, that's when God found you. That's when he died for you. That's when he chose you. And that's when he called you. When you choose to place your trust in God, to place your trust in Jesus Christ, when you choose to accept the gift of unending grace, of unmerited favor, you're made right with God. That's the gospel. See, when it comes to your shame, when it comes to the thing that you've canceled yourself over, the enemy is going to try to convince you and remind you of the 3 Ps. He's going to try to convince you of a lie that's personal, permanent, and pervasive. He's going to try to convince you that your failures define you, but that's not the story. That's not the real story. That's not a true story. That is a lie. The real story, the true story of the good news of Jesus Christ is that the chains of sin and death and condemnation have been forever broken. The mission of of Jesus was to confirm and seal with a covenant promise that God's grace is personal. That his grace is specifically for you, not just like in some sort of like vast, like you get caught up in the midst of everybody else because it's for everybody else. No, it's for you. Right now, right where you are. The mission and the message of Jesus is that because of what Christ did, not because of what you've done, because of what Christ did, God's grace is permanent. He died once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that you might be made close to God. And there's nothing in all of creation, not height or depth. There's nothing that can separate you from the love, the saving power of Jesus Christ, our Lord. And the victory of Jesus over death declares that God's grace is pervasive, that there's no area of your life that is untouched, that there's no area of your life that's beyond reach, that there's nothing, absolutely nothing that is beyond redemption. And one of the prevailing messages of the life of Moses, there are so many that we could look at, but one of them is this: never declare canceled over what God has declared called. Never declare canceled over what God has declared called. I'll close with the words of pastor and author Timothy Keller. He wrote this. He says, the essence of gospel humility, and humility is under having a right view of ourselves, a proper, appropriate view of ourselves. He says the essence of gospel, Jesus-centered humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself, but of thinking of myself less. In other words, it's not about who you are, it's about who he is. You're not called and qualified for a significant role in the mission of God that extends into your home and your neighborhood and your family and your workplace because of who you are. You're called and qualified because of who Jesus of Nazareth is. And he has not canceled you. He has called you. And don't you dare ever cancel what he's called. Let's pray together.
Thank you for listening. For more information, go to visithopechapel.com.